Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. I am here with someone I've had on previously, that is Jiho. He was the gentleman responsible for the discussion on South Korea. Now, some of you might remember that he's in fact an economist and he specializes in labor economics. And today's topic is a topic related to economics. We're talking about the universal income and automation. At least I think that automation is related to the possibility of a universal income. Before I turn over the floor to him, though, I'd speak a few thoughts on the universal basic income from my perspective. I think increasingly it's clear that in this world there are more and more jobs that simply aren't fillable by your average person. And by average, we have to, basically average intelligence people, because intelligence is IQ, or maybe G is general intelligence. It's probably a better predictor of certain things. There's just too many jobs that are too complex, and the jobs that aren't complex are increasingly automated. And so this notion that is actually very much a right-wing notion, I think, that everyone could do some kind of job isn't necessarily true, or won't be true in the not-too-distant future. And there's good evidence to suggest that socioeconomic inequality, when it's too severe, can lead to, at the very least, unrest, if not outright violence, or massive violence. And so the question here is, if a universal basic income were to be introduced, that probably would be the reasoning behind it, I would suspect, because there'd be too many people not able to do jobs that used to be, work on a conveyor belt or whatever the sort of blue-collar jobs used to be. They won't be around forever, and I think sooner rather than later, things will change rapidly. Now, Gio, you said that, just before, that there's no actual experimentation on universal basic income. The closest thing I'm aware of was an experiment they did in India with people who were poverty-stricken. They had no money. They gave them, for a certain period of, I think it was a few months, a basic income every day. And with that income, they were able to establish some kind of small business or what have you. I don't think that's the idea behind the UBI in the West, though. So maybe, as an economist, as a labor specialist, you can offer your thoughts on it, and I'll give the floor over to you.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think the experiments in India also had a good idea. So in the 60s or 70s, I think in the United States, we also had a negative income tax experiment, which kind of fizzled out. People got disinterested in the results, and now we're also having a sort of a renewed interest on universal basic income, and there are a couple of experiments that are going on at the moment. I think the real big flaw with these experiments, that includes the experiment in India, and also is applicable to the experiments in the 70s, is that these are all not guaranteed to last. So if you really wanted to see any sort of labor effects on part of the worker, you'd have to see you'd have to give them, kind of guarantee them this basic income for the rest of their life, basically, to strongly predict what kind of effect it would have on their labor supply or their willingness to work. But none of these are, and they're basically temporary payments, and the effect of temporary payments is really different from the idea of the universal basic income, because the idea of from what I perceive, the idea of the universal basic income is to kind of eliminate the sort of anxiety that's related to loss of income, I suppose, to a certain extent. And what we are experimenting now, or what people have experimented before, isn't that it's a short-term payment of a certain period, and that obviously has a different effect. If you know that the payments are going to be cut at some point, you're going to try to do something with it. I mean, you're more incentivized to do something with it.
Well, isn't that the general concern from people who are critical of, say, UBI? I have mixed feelings about it. I don't know what I think, if I'm perfectly honest. I mean, exactly, but that it would disincentivize people from working. Say, if a universal basic income covered all the basic bills and utilities and everything, why would people? I mean, this is the question somebody I might ask. Why would people go to work? And if that were to happen, there would be not as much tax revenue, and governments couldn't fulfill their so-called functions anymore. And you make an excellent point that if the universal basic income were implemented, it would have to be essentially this permanent thing, like the welfare state sort of become.
Yeah, exactly.
In a lot of Western European countries in particular, no citizen of those particular countries, and many people who aren't even citizens, can really fall in hard times because you can just apply for welfare checks. And we know that welfare disincentivizes work. I know people that make pretty much the same amount of money as people working part-time at least, or even full-time in a few cases, collecting various welfare payments. So I'm not sure if a universal basic income wouldn't have that same effect, because effectively it's the same thing, more or less, in that context. I think. Maybe I'm wrong, since you're the economist.
I wouldn't kind of try to wave around my economist credentials too much. I mean, there's nothing that we know that much yet. I mean, we just don't know.
Put it this way, or as a smart guy at least, who's well versed in economics. I mean, if we see that people abuse the welfare system and choose not to work because they receive a sufficient income from government payouts, then what would be different about a UBI that would then make them think, oh, well, I have everything I need. I'm going to work an extra 30 or 40 hours a week, or I'm going to work 30 or 40 hours a week despite the fact that I have everything I need. I suppose for luxury items, but I'm trying to just connect the dots here, because if it's the case, it's not universally the case. Not everyone abuses the welfare system, but there are plenty of people who've been on it for years and can never really leave it, and particularly in the wealthier countries in Western Europe. What would deter people on a universal basic income from abusing the system, or rather, I can't really,
I think the idea of the universal basic income is that basically you wouldn't care, and you would kind of rely on the inherent willingness to work of the poor, I guess, or the working class to make this work. And I suppose this works to some extent in Western Europe, because this is just my feeling. There's no economic analysis. So if you tried the same thing, this sort of Western European welfare state in East Asia, for example, I don't think it would work at all. I think the willingness to work for East Asians would be much less than it is for I guess white Europeans. For some reason, I find it kind of surprising that so many Swedes work, or so many of these Scandinavian people work.
Yeah, I find it shocking too. I talk to them on online gaming, and occasionally I'll talk to a Norwegian guy I play with, one who says he doesn't like other Norwegians because they're lazy and they don't really work. He likes working. He wants to move to the United States. I guess he's different, but I mean, no one's forced to work.
Yeah, and I think. So for me, what's really surprising is that these Europeans would work, even though for me it seems like a lot of other ethnicities wouldn't do that. I mean, that's my guess. So if you implement this universal basic income, you'd kind of have to rely on the basic work ethic of the people, sort of this. I don't know where it comes from, but sort of this European approach. I mean,
it's called sort of the Protestant work ethic.
Exactly.
But I mean, in your own country of South Korea, we know that there's a big issue with taking care of the elderly, and the familial bonds that used to be really strong are slowly dissolving. Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me if, in order to compensate, and I suppose that, the South Korean government intervened and said, well, we're going to have some kind of, at least elderly welfare system. I'd imagine it's unlikely, but it could happen.
I think they have some sort of minimal payment that really doesn't cover much. It's nothing like a basic income. So you see a lot of people collecting trash because they don't have any money. A lot of old people. But anyway, getting back to the universal basic income, it would rely on the basic work ethic. And the other aspect of this is that the tax rates for the wealthy would go up by a lot. So So I know that the one other so let me just wind back and give you the sort of the evolution of how my opinions on universal basic income is. First when I heard of it, I thought it was a nice idea, but the more I think about it, it seems kind of unrealistic. I mean, or difficult to implement. And one aspect is sort of this funding aspect. In order to fund this, you'd have to collect. So if you wanted to pay, let's say, $10,000, and that's not a lot of money for every person in the United States. That's like $3 trillion, assuming a population of 300 million.
Right.
And that would double the U.S. government spending, and a lot of proponents for the universal basic income say that, you'd get rid of Social Security, you'd get rid of Medicaid, Medicare, and all these other welfare programs to fund this. And for me, I don't see how that would work politically. So if you think about it, the biggest beneficiaries of something like a universal basic income would be single men, I think. Mm-hmm. Because right now, if you're a single guy, your access to welfare is very limited. Mm-hmm. There isn't. I mean, government wants you to work, and they're not willing to give you a lot of leeway in terms of welfare money. Yeah. So the biggest beneficiaries would be with universal basic income would be single men. And if you think about it, the current welfare system is set up to help women, children, the elderly, or minorities. And these people, I mean, if you want to take money away from these people and give it to a group that includes a lot of single men, I think you'd have a lot of political opposition to it. I think it'd be very difficult to implement by taking away existing welfare. You'd have to add it on top of it. And if you add like a $3 trillion spending on top of what we have now, I mean, the tax rates for the wealthy would go up by a lot.
Which would drive away potentially industries and business outside of the respective country.
Yeah, exactly. And also, a lot of these high-income people are, they're the productive type of people, I guess. People who work really hard. And you might think that they would work less if tax rates go up to such an extent. So two aspects of it. I don't see how you could fund it by collecting more taxes from high income people, and then the difficulty is that even for the beneficiaries, they would have to have this really strong work ethic that I don't know that exists. I mean, outside of some European countries.
Well, I mean, I can't help but think that maybe the UBI is also something that, if it were implemented, could only be country specific, like a place like Norway, which has this sovereign oil fund, or countries that already have a lot of wealth. I don't think Italy, which has a lot of financial problems, could say, "Oh, here we go, universal basic income." There's that practical issue as well. And so in saying that, you're kind of, it's contradicting the universality of it, because if it's not something that's universal, just like most countries in Europe have some form of welfare, but a few countries have the same degree of welfare as, say, Scandinavia, or even a place like the Netherlands. And so none of these things can, because the economic circumstances in each country are always different, none of these things can be implemented in exactly the same way. And I'm deeply skeptical, ultimately. I don't know what I think exactly, but I'm skeptical of the universal basic income, because I just see too much abuse of the welfare system. And people generally, I'm not going to lie, I work as much as I have to. Sometimes I'll push myself beyond what's necessary. But even then, it's because maybe there's something I need to get, or there's some, like, I need to move soon, maybe, or whatever. I think that's how most people are. I've never been on welfare. I don't think I'd feel pretty guilty if I were, but I think that there's just, if you could get everything you needed, why would you bother? So, but the other hand, trying to tie this into automation and just lots of jobs no longer being available. I mean, you're a labor economic specialist. Yeah. The amount of jobs left for, well, for lack of a better word, average people or even just dumb people, they're going to be increasingly fewer and fewer, I think, in the future, and not too distant future. So how does one address that other than...
So I think the current lack of the explanation for the current lack of jobs is not clear. So I mean, it definitely could possibly be due to automation, or it could possibly due to other.
I don't mean to interrupt. Would you agree, though, that effectively, globally, and certainly in terms of the United States, Europe, and Australia, this is my own view, that we've not recovered from the 2008 Great Recession? That we're still basically, it's like a leaky gas tank on a car or a truck that is like it's still leaking, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I mean, there's no disagreement on the fact that there hasn't really been an economic recovery after the Great Recession. I mean, to the extent that there has been, it's been very limited.
Yeah.
With Australia, actually, they've benefited from China a lot during the Great Recession because they were buying so much natural resources.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree that the labor market has really suffered after the Great Recession. I mean, there could be multiple reasons for this. For example, there's still a lot of debt in the economy that really hasn't been cleared. That could be an issue. I mean, a lot of people talk about the amount of regulations that's being put on. I think some people blame like healthcare reforms. So I mean, there's multiple factors that could be going in, and one of these is obviously automation. The issue with automation is that people have been talking about this for a long time. And while I agree that the current level of automation might be something that we haven't seen before, this concern isn't something new, right? So people have had this concern about the changing structure of the economy and how capital replaces labor, and there's going to be an insufficient number of jobs for I mean, ever since the Industrial Revolution, I'd say.
Yeah.
And it's been a continual process. I think the one difference in this current wave of automation is that, like you said, it could really remove a lot of the manual labor and leave generally the high IQ type of jobs. And right now, I'd say it's still early to kind of make that conclusion.
Right.
And with respect to automation, I don't know how much of it can be automated. I think truck driving, I think you brought this up in a previous video before. I think truck driving obviously is one type of job that could go, that could foreseeably go because people are developing software to replace it at the moment.
Which is more accurate and more reliable, or could potentially be, rather.
Yeah, exactly. But we'd have to see, we'd have to see more of it. And I think if automation really went on this sort of way that a lot of people are worried, then there might be more of a justification for this universal basic income and this increased taxes. But
because that's the thing I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Gio, that people. I mean, the problem is that when people really are lacking in basic resources, I mean, they can get violent, and when there's enough of them, that's a problem, even for the wealthier, the middle class, or the upper middle class. I mean, it might be that the UBI is implemented in just as a way to stave off that, I guess, bottom rung of society, so they have enough to, like, maybe if you don't meet a certain income, that's when you have a UBI. But that wouldn't be a UBI anymore because not everyone would get it. But they might call it that. It's like, okay, well, you only make, I don't know, $20,000 a year. It's not, and inflation's much higher, and it's not being compensated for. And so here, UBI for this amount income bracket, because those people could, in fact, because those people tend to also be on the, not always, but often on the lower IQ scale, they're also more inclined to be violent in general. I don't think, I don't know if there's a way around that long term. I mean, but then again, I'm not an economist like you, so these are just sort of my speculative thoughts.
I mean, I'm about as informed about this topic as you are, so I mean, I'd be. Well, I think the issue for me is, I mean, okay, so first of all, I think the income threshold. I mean, you can make it so that it's economically the same thing as a universal basic income. The issue is the tax burden wise, it'd probably also be the same thing. You just it's just rearranging the numbers in a way, so it wouldn't be that much different. It might look different in terms of budgetary perspective, but economically it would be the same thing. With people becoming more violent, I mean, I don't know. We'd really have to see it. I think you'd have to ask people to sacrifice a lot of work, or ask them to work despite high taxes to guarantee the income of other people.
Well, I think, I mean, this is based on sociological experiments. So poverty itself is not really an issue if everyone else is poor, but when you get massive income disparity, people get disturbed, and we have historical evidence for that. I mean, there are a lot of causes to the French Revolution, but what you had in France for decades, if not centuries, was an entrenched aristocracy that was living the good life, whilst everyone was dying and living on crumbs. I mean, that wasn't the only reason, but it was certainly part of the reason. And so we have and there are other examples of this. We have a historical precedent to predict violent activity, mass violent activity, if socioeconomic disparity gets to be great enough. And so it might just be a pragmatic decision that people take eventually. So, give them whatever they need just so we don't have some rebellion or something. Because I can't try to look at it. I'm trying to look at it from a perspective of how one could avoid this long term. I suppose, people, as long as people are comfortable, they don't have an issue. So if they have their soap operas and their fast food and their bland entertainment, okay. But that might be an interesting thing to talk about as well, because all that stuff's getting cheaper and cheaper. I mean, it's or it's more accessible than ever. So maybe that in a way that wasn't, say, over 200 years ago during the time of the French Revolution. So maybe as long as the sort of cheap modern entertainment and accessibility to things that people regard as necessary is still there, it really won't matter if the jobs disappear, full-time jobs or not. And of course, fewer and fewer people, especially in Western Europe, especially in Germany, is the lowest birth rate in the world. Most native Germans are having children. So children are expensive, and so they cost less. It costs less.
So maybe so maybe the lower birth rate could be possibly a long-term answer for it, if you have lower supply of labor relative to capital, then it could partially reduce the burden of anything like a universal basic income.
I agree with that, but then again, in Europe we have mass unskilled immigration. It's continuous, and it's going to pick up, I think, in the spring and summer. So that's another issue. I mean, of UBI, and you've talked about this before, but you can't have UBI and mass immigration at the same time. No, you can't even really have you can't even have a robust welfare state and mass immigration at the same time.
Yeah, the issue is, though, that a lot of the people who want open borders and who are for immigration are not gonna say we should shut down immigration because we have UBI. So realistically, if you think about the way the political process works, I mean, you can introduce UBI, but you'd likely have immigration. I mean, all it took was that photo, right, of that child.
Yeah.
And then you had like mass immigration. So you could imagine. I mean, you can imagine people initially saying, "Well, okay, we'll limit immigration," but I don't see how that would last, given the nature of the people. I mean, if the people that are in power or who control the cultural narrative remain in place, I don't know how you would control that. And also, I mean, just going back to the issue with inequality. I mean, the inequality is had been becoming worse and worse. I think ever since the 70s. So, I mean, inequality is definitely a big issue, and universal basic income could be a way of kind of addressing that problem. The issue is that this has to be sustainable. I agree that if you have UBI, there'd be less. I mean, there would be some sort of a moral justification for people to not kind of be violent, or I suppose. But if it isn't funded properly, it would always just be a short-term solution, and you would just be facing the same problem down the line.
It seems to me that many of these solutions being offered, or the solutions that have been thought of, are short-term solutions. I mean, people don't, in Europe in particular, Western Europe, don't really want to think about the long-term viability of the European welfare state. And to be fair, it worked okay before mass immigration, when immigration was much more controlled and limited.
Yeah.
But that's changing, and it's kind of broken. It doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, everything at this point in time just seems like a Band-Aid, and I can't help but wonder if at some point in time the politicians are going to have to get real and just be very honest and realistic about things. They can say, well, here's the deal. I remember a German economist, I think he was an economic sociologist. Anyway, in any event, I'm paraphrasing. It was over a year ago. He said something to the effect of something like the politicians need to come clean at some point in time, and then the peoples of Europe, or Germany in this case, he was talking, would have to make a decision and say, look, we can devolve into a country like Brazil, which will have, you'll still survive.
Yeah.
It won't be as nice, but the standard of living will drop dramatically, and we can accept that and say it's worth it for the sake of maintaining mass immigration, and although the welfare state will suffer greatly. Or they can, you can shut down the borders and start being much more severe about who you let in, and restrictive. And I think there's no real in between. I think long term, if this continues, the economy won't be able to sustain itself at the same levels, and so the standard of living will drop overall. Or, they do become much more restrictive. I don't see any of the mainstream parties in Europe, the ones that aren't sort of, it's not even, they call them right-leaning. They're economically not right-leaning, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of elections coming up. If they got into power, I mean, they would certainly limit immigration. That might help sustain the normal welfare system. I don't know, but UBI just seems like a pipe dream given this situation, when even normal welfare is unlikely to last for a long time.
Yeah, I think one argument that I heard for UBI is that if you provide this and free people from this basic sort of economic anxiety, then they'll be able to be super creative and do things that we're not capable of imagining right now.
Yeah.
And they'll create some sort of economic value that isn't that well measured right now, but we'll only be able to see it after.
That seems very hypothetical. Although, to be fair, in the case of people who were poverty-stricken, like this experiment in India, I think it was half a year, because they were desperate to get out. I mean, most people in poverty are desperate to get out. There's a basic motivation because their basic needs aren't being met, and so being paid, I think a few dollars a day was enough for them, or the equivalent, to start some sort of minor food business, such that their quality of life improved drastically. However, so you had a lot of motivation there, and I could see that being a universal thing with human beings, that given a certain economic threshold, yes, it could work, something like that. And that too, as you point out, that was temporary. It was at best for a year. I think it was half a year.
Yeah.
The whole creative argument, I'm pretty skeptical about that, because, I mean, sure, it's just a matter of a numbers game. Probabilistically speaking, there would be somebody out there, or a bunch of people who would be more creative. Would that be sufficient to justify, not even justify, to, I guess, equalize the losses the financial losses that are accrued due to a lack of or a lowered revenue, tax revenue, because of people just not working as much as they used to? I don't know. Would it balance that out? I can only guess. I don't think it would.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But that's one argument that I've heard. I mean, it's kind of similar to the inherent work ethic type of argument that you would work even though you don't have to. And I don't know. I don't think that's universal across the human species.
I think it really comes down to the individual. And look, if I don't play the lottery, but if I won the lottery, would I? Well, I still would produce videos that are interesting to me, I guess, but I wouldn't. All the additional stuff that I do, like boring commercial work, and I wouldn't do that anymore.
Yeah,
I mean, most people work not because they like it, but because they have to, and so it doesn't. Go on.
Yeah, so I mean, work has to create value for somebody else and not just for yourself.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the
exactly
basis of this economic thing. Another concern that I had with it is with the family, actually. So with this universal basic income, I think the current proposals are saying that you should only pay it to adults. But then again, I don't see this as justifiable. I don't see why this should only be paid to adults. I think it should be paid to children as well. And I think you only need a couple of news articles and then you'll have it for children. So let's say you have an orphan that can't get any money, or you have some child that's like being abused by their parents, and the parents are kind of taking all their kind of abusing the child. So I think it would eventually end up with a system that you would have to provide universal basic income to children as well. And this would give great incentives for lower income households to have a lot of children. And then there's also
Gio, my concern there would be, well, it's not even my concern. I suppose it would be an argument you'd hear from some people. They would say, well, then you're effectively teaching young children the idea that there's always something, basically money grows from trees, like my father used to say.
Exactly.
You think that money grows from trees, when you're a kid, you want everything and you can't get everything, so, or at least it used to be the case. That sort of thing. And as a child, you don't actually need that much money, right? So, I suppose it's changed quite a bit. I think children these days are much more expensive than they used to be.
That's true. But I think, I mean, the incentive for children to kind of develop their human capital so that they'd be useful in a fully automated world, where you'd have to be really smart to be able to do anything, that incentive would also kind of be diminished.
Yeah.
I guess the hope is for gene modification if we go into science.
I've talked about this so many times. I honestly think, and I have a big video planned down the line. Well, not just covering genetic modification, but other things related to it. But yes, I think it's kind of like all roads lead to Rome. All roads seem to lead to genetic modification. The only, but even that's problematic because let's say we have a fully working model for genetic modification, that improves health, intelligence.
Yeah.
Clearly, the wealthiest people would get access to it first, and eventually it would go down in price, I imagine, but it would take quite a while. So, I mean, I'm not sure how that would be implemented exactly. And right now, I think we're still decades away from that.
Yeah.
And say the next 3 or 4 decades, I doubt I'll be alive by the end of that, but still, there's all. I mean, that's a lot of time for all kinds of things to happen. Violent rebellion, wars. The world could, blow itself up before we even get close to that sort of thing. But absolutely, I think because of the way human evolution has worked, inequality, which we're talking about now, a specific kind, financial inequality or economic inequality, is fundamentally worked into the system. There's just no way around it. There are too many variables involved. Even if I've made this argument before, if I hadn't been born to, say, a middle-class New York City family, instead, but had the exact same, say, genetics or intelligence, but had been born in some town in Alabama with 2,000 people, it's quite possible that I might never have gotten out of there, and obviously the environment would have had a tremendous impact. Yeah. So it's just there's no way you can achieve this in a sort of economic equality, which is why I'm opposed to a lot of left-wing doctrines, because they have a utopian view of the world, and I think given our technology and what we can do, there's not much we can. It's just something you have to accept.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you. I think with regard to, I mean, I guess the hope for gene modification is that once you have let's say everybody has an IQ of 180 or above, then maybe they'd be able to contribute to a society where you need a lot of
180. I mean, we might be able to figure out galactic solutions beyond.
Exactly.
That would be incredible.
Well, I mean, or something like. I mean, 180 is extreme. Let's say 130, or 120, or 115.
Yeah, even that would be sufficient to. I think even at 115, you could get a lot of people to do kinds of jobs that they're just not capable of doing now.
Yeah.
But once again, the world population is huge. There would be a financial hierarchy of who gains access to that first, this kind of technology, and we're just decades away. Now, it might be the case that some of these Band-Aid solutions that we've been proposing would be at UBI or fiddling with immigration. Like maybe you could put these Band-Aids on for a few decades to prevent something horrible from happening.
Yeah, by time, right?
Yeah, by time, before you get to the point where the inevitable needs. Well, it's not inevitable, but the necessary needs to happen where we fundamentally modify our genes. I mean, look, I do think that's an inevitability because people already do that. They're genetic screenings to see if babies are going to be born healthy. If two parents have some sort of hereditary disease and they're both carriers, I mean, people do this already, and so I don't think it's that far off. It's just that that there are other issues. I had a talk recently with the reactionary expat on this issue, and he's even uncomfortable with it. People feel very uncomfortable about this sort of thing. So there would be an enormous social hurdles to get over, even to broach the topic and talk about it. I don't have a problem talking about it. You don't. Maybe some other people don't. But the idea of fundamentally changing human beings, for one thing, you'd have to admit that a lot of people are, for lack of a better word, you could say intellectually defective. And I think that's universally true. Like, if somebody wanted to appoint me, or get me into a theoretical physics program at MIT or Caltech, I would be intellectually defective too. So I think it's just a matter of, at what point in time you become intellectually defective, but still, you'd have to admit that huge masses of people are intellectually defective, mentally defective, basically, and so they need some kind of boost in order to get to some level where they could actually contribute something and self-sustain. And even that discussion, I think, is absolutely impossible in normie land. Nobody would talk about that. Go on, please.
I mean, there's another point I wanted to bring out about automation is that this rapid improvement in automation that we're kind of seeing right now, I think is likely to slow down if we don't see improvements in sort of the programming aspects. I mean, I've looked at some of the stuff. I mean, Are you
referring partly to Moore's law, maybe, or
something like that? So I'm not a computer scientist or anything like that. But I mean, sometimes if you just look at what they're doing, they have really fancy names like machine learning and deep learning and neural networks and stuff like that. But if you look at what it is it's at the end of the day, it's statistics.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, one thing, the industry, I don't really work in it too much anymore directly, but when I was much more active in translation, I still follow some of it.
Yeah.
The most effective translation modules, computer-based modules, the sort of machine modules, are statistical. They don't use. Of course, they use syntax. You can't decipher things otherwise, but it's they're statistical models based on frequency and things like that, more than they are other types of models that they've tried in the past that just don't work. For example, Chomsky. I mean, I don't think it really counters his theories necessarily, but this idea of a universal grammar. Well, using UG, universal grammar, for machine learning or machine translation turned out to be much less effective than just giving them sort of statistical abilities that could sort algorithms by statistical frequency. So I mean, things. I don't know. There might be some hard limits there. Well, possibly.
So I mean, so the statistical theories that they're using, I mean, it's old. I mean, these theories have been around for a long time. The problem is that you weren't able to utilize it to its full extent. And now that we have the hardware capabilities and we have the internet and we have all this data, we're better able to utilize it, and we are able to automate things that we weren't able to before in a much more effective way using that type of technology. I say it's almost more hardware than it is software driven. I mean, there's a lot of clever ways that people have kind of coded this, I think. But at the fundamental level, I see it as kind of it's predictive statistical models basically. At the end of the day, and so I think there's a limit to what you can automate with that. So I think there probably is going to be, with the current level of technology, there's probably going to be a limit to how much we can automate. And then there's going to have to be another leap that makes a different sort of that utilizes a different kind of approach to it. That perhaps uses something more kind of a human type of thinking. I'm not sure how that would work. And
then we're talking about a functional AI that could, effectively has human characteristics, which is something a lot of people are, there seem to be two camps on the AI question. Some people think it's a real danger, and other people think, because there are all kinds of nuanced approaches to it. You give create an AI that's smarter and better than human beings. Well, what if the AI thinks that the best thing for humans is for humans not to be around because it calculates that humans create immense suffering, or they do X, Y, Z, whatever. That's a complicated issue. We're not even close, I don't think, although some people think
I mean, we're probably close to gene modification than we are to that kind of
agreed. We're definitely much closer to gene modification, and I think that's much more reasonable. I think if you could actually talk to people about it, they probably would feel. I mean, there are ways you could talk about it or broach the topic without it sounding really odd. For example, what if we could modify your gene such that you don't suffer from type 1 diabetes? Your children will, we know based on, I don't know, gene scans, we'll call them that now, that's just made up, but genetic scans that, your children are 81% chance of having X disease, but we can modify that. It would always start with, trying to fix what conditions that are universally viewed as defective, diseases and things like that. And from there, it would go on to other things.
So with gene modification, I think the effect of national competition might have an effect on it. So I think China.
China.
They don't really have much in terms of. They don't share the same type of ethical concerns as a lot of the Western countries do with sort of some of these type of research, from what I can tell.
No, they don't. They don't. I mean, they're actively pursuing this stuff, and
So if they start doing it, I think you'd be forced to kind of follow.
And I talked about this recently with Expat. It's kind of like, well, he had a video where he talked about this too, and I agree. Is that you look at the developments in East Asia during the industrial era, and China really fell behind. And Japan seemed to actually make almost a national level decision to import Western technology. Well, it wasn't Western at the time. Western technology and modifications, and they became an industrialized nation. Now, China didn't really do that at the time, and they really fell behind, and they were still more or less an agrarian society. And they lost out. I mean, they lost out to the British, the Dutch, on multiple fronts. So, I mean, I think in that case, if China were to really push the envelope and they don't have these ethical concerns, some Western nations might just say, we just need to do this to catch up. Others might fall behind and just think, well, we're not going to do this. Ironically enough, I think of the people, I think the United States would probably be one of the countries that would fall behind first because of religious concerns, for example.
I agree with that, definitely.
I don't see Europe's pretty secular. Well, not talking the immigrants necessarily, but the native Europeans are pretty secular. And I also think that, well, I mean, it's changing, but native Europeans also tend to be less SJW, I find, than people in the Anglosphere. So I think it would, if anyone were to fall behind, it would be the United States because of bizarre religious concerns and things like that.
Yeah. I mean,
no, I'm done on that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I mean, it's a topic. I think that might be one way we could try to deal with automation going forward. I mean, maybe
it seems the only way. I don't.
Yeah.
It seems the only way to correct for natural sort of biological imbalances that lead, as well as circumstantial ones, but mostly that lead to economic disparities and inequality. I can't think of any other way. We know from historical records, because the 20th century is littered with corpses, that modified political systems don't really lead to this utopian outcome that people want.
Yeah.
So we have good evidence. We have basically a century of that. So that can't be an option, and I hope that no one will be stupid enough to try the stuff that people tried in the 20th century, especially the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
But it's questionable. Just like I said, I think what we can do in the meantime are these band-aid solutions until we get there. But this is my big thing, though, is that for years now I've pushed for the necessity of really investing all of our resources as a society towards this goal of genetic modification and improving ourselves, because there's no other way out of this problem, the economic doldrums, but also many other problems.
Yeah.
The mankind's stupidity has always been his greatest flaw, and mankind has relied on a select few to sort of pull us out of the darkness. The Newtons of the world and the Alexander Graham Bells and all these people who've contributed something of vast and great importance.
Yep.
But as the population grows and there are fewer and fewer of these people, well, I mean, what can you do? I just don't see any way around it. And so I think we should all be pushing for this, whatever people's political views might be, because there's no government solution for this. The UBI, we've been talking about a lot, but that is a band-aid. That can't be something that's in place forever. It seems to just fundamentally violate economic principles such as, sustainability long term, right? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah, just think about it. If you have, let's say you have a distribution of IQ and income is kind of
strongly correlated.
Strongly correlated with IQ, and you have a lot of people, high IQ people, and you want to tax these people to give universal basic income to low IQ people. Let's say on average. Of course, that's not going to be all like this. And you give incentives for these people to have a lot of children, and you provide a disincentive for high IQ people to have a lot of children, for example. And then the social structure changes so that it's not going to be sustainable anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's effectively what we have on a modified level with the welfare state in a lot of these places. Poor people, who also tend to be, not universally the case, but oftentimes have lower IQs, not as intelligent, have many more children. I mean, it's a huge problem in Great Britain. This sort of chav culture, as it's called, where, I mean, you have these 25-year-old girls who've already had 3 or 4 children sometimes. And at the other end, I mean, the most educated people tend to have the fewest children. And I think that's a natural tendency. That this seems to be an observable trait across human cultures in the modern world. And certainly in South Korea and Japan.
Yeah, I think, but historically through civilization, I'd argue it used to be the other way around. If you were poor for whatever reason, then you were. I mean, everybody had a lot of children, but if you were poor,
they wouldn't survive as much.
Yeah, you wouldn't make it.
Well, right. So, but in previous times, there was a real survival question, and being well. Of course, if people had children who are wealthy, then they might, because of nutrition and shelter and other reasons, would have a greater chance of keeping them alive. And of course, the greatest asset children have been historically as labor utilities. I mean, it wasn't uncommon 150 years ago, 200 years ago, to send an 8-year-old in a field to harvest corn or get the hay or what have you. And as that need has disappeared, so too is the need to have lots of children. So it's a complicated issue. But yeah, the one you mentioned, the sort of disincentivizing the high IQ people by sort of, we already sort of have a modified version of that in the welfare state.
Yeah.
It's definitely creating a lot of tension, I think, among certain people. And I think people on the left, or even just normies who really are sort of politically apathetic, they're all cool with all of this until their own lives become affected. So as long as they can live in their, all white neighborhoods, or mostly white with a couple of Koreans and Japanese there, I guess.
Yeah.
And I know some of these people in the United States. I mean, they're behind closed doors. They say, well, I would never live in that neighborhood, because they're all cool with this stuff until it starts affecting them, in which case they might actually think differently. But the only thing I can think of, whether it comes to UBI or some of those similar things, is these are just band-aids that might last a decade, maybe two, until something much more long-term. And the long-term the end game for me is, or as human beings, I think, is that deep genetic modification, because without it, we're just screwed. I don't understand why people think it's great to, I guess, to cling to this stuff that just sort of works for us, like all this tribal stuff and basically these primitive instincts that served us well on occasion. All this stuff I find it's just heavy baggage, and so we really need to move forward.
It'd be nice if everybody could get along, right? The issue is that they don't.
Resource scarcity is an issue. And the best way of solving the problem of resource scarcity is having lots of smart people who can create solutions for it. I think, at least. And we don't know. I mean, that's huge. If the world IQ average, which is much lower, get us to 115, that would be incredible, because then of course, at the higher ends of the distribution curve, there would be, you'd have IQs way past 200, which are almost impossible to find these days. That would be an incredible thing. And the economy itself would change. People's tastes in consumerism would change. I think a lot of this sort of trashy entertainment that people find great would disappear virtually overnight. It'd be pretty incredible. It's just how we get there, and I think we will get there. It's just not enough people are invested in the idea. It's taboo to talk about, and it's just mostly people's apathy, but also the politically correct culture that we live in these days.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. Is there? Do you think there's a way that UBI might work?
Well,
in a sustainable fashion?
No. Because as I said before, I think UBI is just a new form of welfare, and I don't think the welfare system, at least in Western Europe in its current state and form, is sustainable long term, because it's being really, really burdened. We know already, because in Germany, pensioners, people who are supposed to receive government benefits because they paid into the system, well, a lot of them are complaining they're not getting enough to cover their basic costs. And it's kind of ironic that the people who are starting to feel these deficits first are the elderly who paid in for decades.
The people who are paying in right now might not see anything. So
they're not going to see anything.
So it's the elderly, as worse off as they are.
Oh yeah, my parents, especially my mother, she knows that she's in her 70s, well in her 70s. She knows she has had it good. She knows that she's lived through some of the best, most prosperous times possible. She's not even a baby boomer, and she knows that my generation, the generation after, is. I don't like to use the term to get shafted, but in some sense, because of the changing world, we kind of did get shafted. And Yeah, I think if you're in the United States and you're paying into, Social Security, good luck with that. If you think you're going to be cashing in on that decades down the line, I don't think it's going to happen. Who knows? It's possible, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible, but I mean, don't think it's going to work out
No.
the way it is. I mean, especially, I mean, at least the United States, the population is increasing.
Yeah, but once again, we're talking about questions like what sector of the population is increasing?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the smart people
Yeah.
who are increasing. It's the average to below average people who create a greater burden, greater financial economic burden long term in a world where automation, even if there are limits, is increasing.
Yeah.
So.
But I mean, if you were some of these like social justice utopian type of people, then you'd think that because population increasing and because everybody has the same sort of productivity, it would be affordable. But in some other countries, like in South Korea, for example, you know that you're screwed. There's no, I mean, population.
Yeah, I mean,
there's no way this is going to work.
Do you think in the case of South Korea that it's mostly well? Why is South Korea never implemented this sort of robust Western style welfare system? I'm just curious, because I've often asked myself that.
Yeah, so it's we've become a developed country only recently, and if you talk to a lot of people, a lot of Korean people, and you tell them that South Korea is a developed country, they'll still say it's not. They'll still say it's a developing country. So we still have that kind of mindset. So the welfare system is from that era of poverty.
Right.
So the social structure just isn't there. So for example, Koreans used to work on Saturdays until 2004.
Yeah, I had to work on Saturdays sometimes when I was there. It's dreadful.
Yeah, yeah. So we transitioned into the 5-day work week in like 2004 or 2003. So that has only been very recent. So I mean, the sort of the mindset was very different. Right now, there's a lot of people. I mean, a lot of Koreans right now are pretty left wing. So we might introduce a lot of welfare programs.
Yeah.
But
that's been on. We talked about the last discussion. That's been on the rise. The sort of left wing thinking. That's sort of global monoculture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as that's an inevitability, I think, as the traditional Korean culture and structures sort of dissolve. Although oddly, I mean, I don't follow it too keenly, but that whole, 공부하다, study until you drop, thing, that's still very much a thing there. I mean, you're with the hagwon after school and all that.
Yeah.
It's all still there. It's strange that that's still that hasn't been dismantled, or at least people don't question it as much as they might, given the trends there.
Yeah, I mean it's very culturally entrenched. So and we don't have the welfare system right now. So maybe if we do introduce something like a universal basic income, it might change. But as of right now, a lot of people do see it as very important. But I mean, I don't think it's as bad as it used to be in the past. I think it's a lot better now. For one thing, there's less students than there used to be before, and more. It's easier. I think. I mean, people complain all the time, but there's just less people competing.
No. Yeah, but I think this is the issue, whether it comes to economics or really any other problem, is that for the time being, people find it very troublesome. But for the time being, we need to accept that human inequality and disparities are just built into the system. It's how we evolved and how the world is, and there isn't a really good solution for fixing that. People have tried, and oftentimes with terrible results, and that go terribly awry, and then these people who are just essentially morons, these social justice warriors who just live in a world that's I think is completely detached from reality. Ironically, they're often upper middle class or some of the wealthiest people in society.
Yeah.
Or not so ironically, because those are the people who are most cut off from reality, who never think about, oh, whoa, this is the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a form of what's called virtue signaling. I think I hear that term a lot. Seems to me.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's virtue signaling, but the funny thing about virtue signaling is that the people who do it the most are the most quite literally the most privileged and wealthiest people in society. They're
yeah,
not, uh, and yet the discussion of the sort we're having now, or similar ones I've had in the past, is you can't really have it with them. They're just living in a different world.
yeah,
Theirs is a world of milk and honey and basically everything they want.
yeah.
They
I mean,
have
so they feel guilty about their good life, maybe.
that's a very charitable interpretation. I mean, that's an extremely charitable interpretation.
Yeah.
I don't think SJWs feel guilty about their good life.
Uh-huh.
I think most of them actually see real deficits in their lives. They're imagined, of course,
Uh-huh.
because they have so much, it just can't be enough. And so
Yeah.
everything needs to fit their own strange view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, well, I mean, it really is the younger generation. I don't know anyone who I still have contact with that I grew up with, or of that similar age bracket,
Mm-hmm.
who really is a kind of SJW. I know a lot of normies who probably wouldn't delve into these topics, but the sort of full-fledged SJW, full-on, I think it's really just this thing for the millennials, your age, I'm not saying you are, but your age
Yeah.
bracket and
Yep.
younger,
Uh-huh.
who've just grown up with the internet and basically having an iPhone or mobile phone glued to their hand and all
Yeah.
these things. Because even though I didn't experience it, I still, I heard war stories from my father who had gone through wars in his lifetime, and it just, well, it was pretty obvious that wasn't desirable. It kind of keeps your head on straight and allows you to have some balance. I also, in my life, visited some truly poor countries where you just don't want to live there. So
Yeah.
I think that they're living in their own little reality, that it's real to them, but outside, they are that's the irony. They are the privileged, these people, these SJWs, but unfortunately, because they're of their wealth and their station, they do have a lot of influence, and that's why you can't even talk about things. This is why the biggest obstacle to genetic modification, or really any discussion on these matters, is you couldn't see in the United States, at least, and other places, English speaking, you couldn't have a lunchtime discussion about what do we do about economic inequality? A lot of the problems are related to intelligence. I mean, you could be fired from your job potentially if someone overheard that. It's considered taboo.
Yeah.
I mean, I was only a child in the 80s for the most part, but I can't imagine that sort of thing like that. That's probably that probably was pretty harmless to talk about 30 years ago or longer. I just can't. But it's just everything becomes so stratified and so.
Yeah. Right now, I think you'd have to convince people that IQ is real.
Right. Well, I already.
Yeah.
I mean, but this is the problem. I just saw a comment and left on one of my older videos about some guy related to Stephen Jay Gould, who's dead, who was he was a Marxist. That doesn't necessarily he was an admitted Marxist. Doesn't necessarily disqualify everything he said, but he had these real concerns about talking about intelligence. I think the general intelligence is probably the best indicator, but even acknowledging that intelligence is a thing, is difficult. This mythology about multiple kinds of intelligence. I mean, clearly some people have different kinds of talents. That doesn't mean that there are multiple kinds of intelligence. We're cut off from discussing that. So this is why this is all niche, and this is my own personal. I mean, this is my own quip, to be honest. With channels like some of these bigger channels who style themselves, cultural liberal. I don't know what they call themselves really, I guess, but cultural libertarians, maybe anti-SJWs. They have such a huge platform. They should be the ones talking about these subjects too, because then it would really make headway, and people would at least have to acknowledge that that the topic's being discussed. No, instead, it's really the shadowy corners of the internet, tiny channels, just myself, who talk about these things, and it's not. I mean, this discussion is not going to see the light of day for a long time.
Yeah.
The other thing is, of course, there are plenty of academics who are involved in this, but they're afraid. They don't really have any political biases, but they know that if they pursue, this was years ago, I think 2005, I don't remember his name. There was a geneticist, a Chinese immigrant at University of Chicago, who, I don't know how it turned out, who discovered that there were differences in the developments in various population groups after they had left Africa, and these differences might have been related to intelligence, and they didn't really take place in Africa. So, I mean, he got shouted down. He eventually just stopped the research, and he even officially said something to the effect of, well, sometimes some things are just better not knowing one way or another.
Yeah.
And this was now 12 years ago. So he's moved on to other subjects because there are other subjects. It's just intelligence is just this really touchy thing. And as I said in a previous talk with Expat, I think it's just this. People tend to equate intelligence with some soul, like that's the essence of a person, and I guess in some sense that's true. Whereas to say that somebody is fast or strong or can jump high, that's not really the person. That's what they're doing. But to say a person's dumb or only so smart that he can do X, or really smart, I mean that seems to describe the actual essence of the person. I mean, it's a bunch of nonsense, obviously. They're all just biological faculties and abilities, but still, I think that's how it resonates with people. And so you don't want to say that. It's like walking up to a huge, fat, ugly person and saying, you're really fat and ugly. I'm sure the person knows it. Although dumb people tend not to know that they're really dumb. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But it's...
I'd agree with that. I think also, I mean, this is pure speculation. It's possible that evolution-wise, it might have been more important to be smart than to be physically capable. Maybe that's why we take it so personally.
Well, I think, well, really, I guess it would depend. Obviously, being physically capable was a huge asset and boon for much of human evolution. When things just came down to brute force, the combination of the two even better. Yeah. But as physical labor has sort of disappeared slowly, and the necessity to do it has disappeared, I mean, the only asset that is really in the realm of athletics. Maybe you can become a professional football player or a basketball player, but that's a very small percentage of the population. So,
before we get too carried away on intelligence, just going back on universal basic income. So I want to hear your opinion on this. So just to play devil's advocate. So if I told somebody, an advocate of universal basic income, that it wouldn't work, I think they would say that it is possible to cut down on other forms of welfare to introduce this universal basic income.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, as I said, UBI is effectively a form of welfare. So if you were to get rid of the conventional welfare, which is basically in some countries as extreme as, say, Norway, I have chronic headaches, I don't need to work for 2 years or whatever. Right? But you can quite literally do that in some cases. Well, then sure. But, I mean, it's basically the same thing given a different name, more or less. That's what I would argue. Yeah.
I mean, so if they were able to get rid of the previous welfare systems, it might be, I mean, the tax rates wouldn't have to really change. So it might be sustainable.
I mean, it might be a little bit more expensive because there wouldn't be really any application process involved. You would just get a check sent to you. You wouldn't actually have to, now there's some welfare systems, you still have to show some evidence that you're not able to, or you're looking for work or whatever.
So I think they would say, you cut. I mean, I'm not advocating this, but people advocating universal basic income would say you'd cut down on administrative costs, which isn't actually that large, but you'd be able to save on that. I guess there's something called a low income trap, where the marginal tax rate for low income people is very high when they leave welfare. So there's a disincentive for these people to work, and this type of welfare would get rid of that. So these people might work more. I mean, these are sort of standard arguments.
You could cut branches of the government, but remember, the people who are going to advocate a UBI are the same people that want to maintain the size of the government and all these programs that may or may not be good. I think a lot of this is just insurmountable, and whatever comes about will just be a band-aid solution for a certain period of time. The best time to be alive was probably the 80s. It was like, I mean, I hate to say it, but for a lot of people, especially in Europe, was, they had the fantastic pension system, quiet, low crime, peaceful societies, yada yada yada. But things change, so that's all done. And whatever is ahead, be it UBI or some modification of that, is. I'm a skeptic of positive outcomes, generally speaking. So I just don't see too many. But the most important battle, really, and I said this in the previous discussion with Expat, is the discussion, the ability of open and free discourse, because that opens up the doorway to discussion on every subject possible, whether it's UBI, and also, most importantly, being able to be honest about these things. And so when you're talking about the pros and cons, not living in a fantasy world, if some government wants to introduce UBI, okay, but let's remember, what are the pros and cons, and be realistic about it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree completely. And I don't know. I mean, UBI still. I don't think. I mean, there's a lot of popular support for UBI right now. I mean, if I looked up YouTube, and I don't think I found a single video that was against UBI.
Well, I suppose it depends on who was not being critical, right?
Yeah. So
it's not. Look, if UBI were a viable thing, I think it would be useful because of the reasons I cited before. Because it might stave off violence until we move to some more advanced state of civilization or human being. But
yeah. There's also a survey by some economists. So there's this thing. I think it's IGM Chicago. They had a survey on universal basic income of kind of prominent economists on their opinions. And on that survey, actually, only one person was for UBI, and everybody else was either uncertain or against it. And this is across the political spectrum, I think. So even people on the left wing, they didn't want welfare cut off for sort of the needy, what's defined as needy people, whoever that may be. And so I mean, so that's how it is for that particular survey that I was able to look up. Well,
it's just the idea of something that's just sort of handed out. I mean, even welfare has, well, ostensibly there's a reason to give it to people if they're disabled or they can't work for a period of time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't, because I think it runs counter to most economists' traditional thinking, whether they're more. I don't even think a guy like Paul Krugman would, who once absurdly advocated that a propagandist alien invasion, or the claim that there's an alien invasion, would be good because it would boost the economy because we'd spend lots of money.
Yeah.
So I don't even think he would advocate something. Well, maybe he would. He's a bit crazy.
But once you mentioned that you'd have to limit immigration, then he'd definitely be against UBI, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, I think so as well. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it turns out, it seems, that UBI, based on everything we've discussed, is at best a Band-Aid solution and quite likely not something that can be implemented long term.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, that's sad news, folks. If you
Well, I mean, I'd be happy to hear any theories on why it might work, but I mean, I haven't really been able to find any. So
yeah. Well, I
mean,
just think
I mean,
practically.
it'd be great for men. I mean, it'd be great for single men. It'd be great for me. I wouldn't have to
You
do it.
don't want to. Are you saying you don't want to work for years on end?
Yeah, exactly, right. So, but because as of now, I mean,
Well, what would you do if you? I mean, you're going to be finishing your PhD soon, and then you're off to Singapore to work in the financial sector.
yeah.
So, I mean, I guess it's a dream job, sort of. But if you didn't have to do that, I mean, what would you do? Would you become a pro gamer? Enter the star class? Sorry, that's really stereotypical. What would you do though? Seriously.
I think right now I'd probably do it, but I wouldn't have done it initially. I think I probably wouldn't have worked so hard in middle and high school. Probably. I probably wouldn't have worked hard in university. I mean, I don't know why I would have worked. I mean, the incentives totally changed. I mean, and I can't say I'd be where I am right now, but I'm given the situation that I'm in, I'd do it. Oh, and speaking of Singapore, I mean, another issue with UBI is that if you're going to tax these high income people for like 60-70% of their income, I mean, they're free to move, right? They can move to places like Liechtenstein or some place like that. So even if they have UBI in that small state, there wouldn't be that much of a burden for them.
Yeah.
Or Singapore. So, I mean, at a certain level of taxation, people might move to other countries. Not only would they work less, they might just move elsewhere that has less of a tax burden. So,
Yeah.
and that's another reason why this UBI may not be sustainable.
Yeah. I mean, it's just that there doesn't seem to be a good long-term solution to any of this, apart from the things we've talked about with genetic modification.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. But I don't see any way past it, and that's why I'm going to continue to advocate for it, and hopefully in the future in greater depth.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah. So 지금 많이 피가 내요. So I'm gonna. I just said I'm quite tired right now in Korean, my rusty Korean, and it is getting late here, so I'm gonna have to wrap this up. But I thank my guest, the esteemed labor economist and expert Jiho, for joining me for this discussion on UBI, automation, and related topics. I hope to have him on in the future again to offer his expertise on these matters.
All right,
So,
well, thank you for having me.
No, thank you. 감사합니다.
Yeah.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.